Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mental Health TV. Really pleased to see you on such a sunny, lovely evening. So thank you very much for being with us. Today, we're going to be talking parental mental health, which is going to be quite a wide-ranging topic. So just before we get started, I'll hand you over to Dave so that you can get your questions in and see how you can participate with us. Hey.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight for MHTV episode 52. We're at 52 already. And just info in how you can get involved. Obviously, watching, that's the first thing. It'd be great, though, to hear your thoughts and comments and questions. You can post these in a couple of different ways. One of them is via the Facebook Live chat. So if you just go to the Facebook Live page, put in a comment or a question, and we'll be able to bring in all the ones that we can tonight. The other option is via Twitter, and all you need to do on your tweets is to include the hashtag MHTV, and we'll be able to see them and again bring them into the conversation this evening. But without further ado, straight back to you, Nicky.
Let's introduce the guests. So first of all, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name's Chris McCree. I work for South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. I work in two departments. I work across the 4 borough community perinatal services, and that's for women accessing mental health services pre and post the birth of their child. I also, and I'm doing some sort of development work there around group work and around, I think, family approach. But I also work in the Centre for Parent and Child Support, which is a CAMS National Specialist Service. And we've developed a team called the Helping Families team, and they provide a parenting programme in the home, an intensive parenting programme in the home for parents with mental health problems where they're worried or professionals are worried about the impact on their children. And there's also a group element to that. That's me.
Fantastic. Claire, hello.
Hi there. Hello, everyone. My name is Clare Dolman, and I'm a journalist and mental health researcher. And I have lived experience of bipolar disorder and postpartum psychosis. So most of my research has focused on perinatal mental health, and particularly for women with severe mental illness. And I've done a PhD on decision-making around pregnancy for women with bipolar disorder. And that was provoked by workshops with women and their partners who could get absolutely no information about preconception and how it affected bipolar, which is massively. So, so that's, I did the PhD on that. And I am also very involved in the campaign to improve perinatal mental health services. And I'm a trustee of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance. And I hope everybody is aware of Everybody's Business campaign, which campaigns for better services, perinatal mental health. And I'm also trustee of Action on Postpartum Psychosis and an ambassador for Bipolar UK.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Much appreciated.
That's okay.
And last but obviously not least, Katie.
Hello. Hi,
Hello.
I'm Katie. I'm a researcher at the Section for Women's Mental Health at King's College London. And so I'm a qualitative researcher, so doing a lot of stakeholder interviews to improve mental health care. And in the last few years, I've been working in maternal mental health. So first on a project in Mozambique with teenage mothers, and I'm currently undertaking an evaluation of community perinatal mental health teams in the NHS. That's me.
Sounds exciting, thank you. So I guess maybe the first thing we should do is try and to understand a little bit about what are the issues that are around parenting and mental health. And I guess if we just come back to you all in the same sort of order, unless anyone wants to jump in. So what are the big issues that we need to be thinking about?
I'm happy to kick off, and then Claire and Katie, jump in. I suppose one of the things, if we come at it from the wider aspect of the Think Family approach, certainly, I'm a mental health nurse, and I've worked in mental health for, over 40 years. And we really struggle to have that kind of whole family approach and think about, certainly within adult services, about relationships and sexual relationships and what our people using our services might kind of want to think about in terms of what works for them. So we tend to always have a habit of working in crisis mode. So, either a woman with a serious mental illness gets pregnant and then we're in crisis, or we have perhaps somebody who accesses our services and they have a young family, and we kind of don't think about what might their support needs might need, and we get to a Friday afternoon and it's a crisis. And then the parent, nobody's ever mentioned my children before, and suddenly we're kind of making referrals, and quite often our families don't access the full range of early help that's possible because they're terrified, because there's huge amounts of stigma that's still associated with being a parent and having a mental illness. There's loads of concern and anxiety about being referred to children's social care. So that means that we don't think about that because we kind of go, oh, well, everything's, looking okay. And certainly in terms of this conversation about preconception, we tend not to proactively, particularly talk to women about, sexual health and well-being. So I'll let my colleagues to kind of come in at that point.
Well, just to pick up on Chris's point about the stigma around social services, I mean, that's certainly something that I'm very aware of in the work that I do. And when I interviewed women about particularly about their decision making and about preconception and how they thought about having children, it was really very, very apparent how difficult it was for them, because they were really scared about raising it with the GP or with the psychiatrist, because they thought that immediately they'll tell us that we shouldn't have children and that kind of thing. And it was quite marked in a lot of the conversations that I had with women with bipolar disorder, that they sort of felt they had to ask permission to have children in the first place because of that stigma. And although that was in the last few years not said overtly, although a few women said it was said overtly to them that they shouldn't have children, but mostly it was just the sort of implication, or being fobbed off and told to sort of go away and think about it more, or things like that, which was really, really hard for so many of these women, because many women with bipolar, the average time to a diagnosis is 10 years. So you're talking about women in their early 30s. It then takes them a few years to get the right treatment and the right medication, and then and then perhaps get settled enough once they're sorted out with a partner. And then so by the time they go to see somebody and get the courage to talk about it, they're like 38, 39, and they've got real problems anyway, fertility wise. So it's a real problem.
Absolutely.
And the other issue is that women kind of hide from services. So taking Claire's point, it's like, okay, I want a child, or I'm going to have a child, and there isn't any pre-planning. So it increases the risk for both them, their baby, the relationship. And then they come into services at the point of crisis. So of course, then inevitably what they feared most has to happen, because then we're all in crisis. So we have to bring in lots and lots of people. And sometimes, again, we don't think, how do we have this conversation? So as the adult mental health practitioner, how do I have that conversation? I think because of our worries, we tend to think, oh, it's somebody else is going to have the conversation. So before we know it, these families can have up to 20 people in the network. And very sadly, over the years I've worked, I've done lots and lots of serious case reviews into child deaths. And you look at the timeline and the chronology about the amount of people that this family were due to go and see. And you're thinking, well, the best will in the world, I wouldn't have managed that. I wouldn't have managed 3 appointments in one 24-hour period in different places in a borough. So, and obviously those reviews, you've got hindsight and you've got an opportunity, but sometimes we just, as services, we need to take a breath and we need to think, okay, how many people are we involving this family? How realistic is that? What are our expectations? Because we want to encourage people to have that conversation, not make it more fearful. So even if social care needs to be involved, some of that is our anxiety. And actually, if we brought people in earlier to the planning, then it makes more sense to families about what everybody's doing, if that makes sense. If there's a coherent,
absolutely,
it kind of go, oh, I understand what the role of the social worker is, because I might need an admission to the mother and baby unit. You know, I might need help because I don't have a family where my 2-year-old can be looked after. I need to think about that, you know. Maybe the process of a family group conference could be a really helpful, but it's who has that conversation. And I think because we're all a bit like, oh, is it us, as I say, that you can end up with lots of people involved and the family just going, I don't know where I'm at.
It's such an overwhelming time as well, isn't it? And I think mothers generally just get so judged by everybody. What you do, what you don't do. And then if it's a first baby as well, or a baby perhaps a little bit later on, everyone's, and then add into that, you know, the anxiety around all kinds of stigma. And I think what you say is really interesting, this idea that sometimes we're like, oh, people are hiding out from services with very good reason. Like, it's just one less thing to be scared and worried about. I'm aware that we didn't get to come to Katie. Was there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I guess I was just going to chip in from the research perspective. So we did a review to look for any evidence-based kind of testing of preconception interventions with women with severe mental illness, and we really didn't find very much at all in terms of RCTs about how is the best way to deliver this kind of information and who does it and what's the format and what are the key intervention points. So even though we know from other parts of preconception research that you have these incredible sort of long-term, low-cost health benefits, and it's a really great example of preventative care, we just don't have the studies to tell us how exactly this preconception can be best delivered for women with serious mental illness. So it's quite a gap. So we're kind of delivering the services before we kind of know exactly what the best way to do so is. So it's definitely an area that requires a lot of focus and a lot of testing to get it finessed.
Or get it happening.
Exactly.
So let's have a little think then. What do we mean? We're talking about preconception work. What does that mean? What does it look like? What do you think?
Well, I'll dive in. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's thinking about having a baby and making those plans. And if you're a woman with a severe mental illness, you have to make those plans well in advance. In some of the workshops that I run with perinatal psychiatrist Ian Jones in Wales, he always says, you know, women are often asked that. They say, well, how long before I want to have a baby should I start planning, thinking about it in terms of going to see the doctor and getting referrals and this, that, and the other. And he says about 2 years. So if that, you know, if I was I was just saying about women tending to be older when they're thinking about this quite often. I mean, not always, obviously, but then to add another 2 years onto that, you know, is quite considerable. And one thing that I think is really important for professionals to be aware of is when they're dealing with women, you know, further back even than thinking about preconception, because lots of sort of women that I spoke to said that when they were diagnosed, say in their mid-20s or 30 or something, I asked them, were they you know, told about the implications of pregnancy? Because I don't know if you know, but for bipolar disorder, you have a 1 in 2, 50% chance of having an episode of illness. And it's a 1 in 4 chance of having a postpartum psychosis, you know, which is a psychiatric emergency and will probably put you in hospital for 6 or 7 weeks or more. And so, you know, it's high stakes for these women, and a lot of them are very frightened about it and find the whole decision-making process very frightening. And but some of them go and talk about this to, you know, whoever, the doctor, and they say, oh, well, you know, have you heard of this? And they've never even heard of this, because when they were diagnosed, you know, 5 or 10 years earlier, they weren't warned that at pregnancy, you're going to have to make a lot of decisions, and it's quite there are quite a few things to consider. So I interviewed a lot of general psychiatrists and asked them about whether they did actually inform women when they diagnosed them, or when they were discharging them from hospital or care or whatever, did they inform them about, the
Sure.
pregnancy, for them to have that in the back of their mind, that they were going to have to give it some thought and everything and prepare for it. And half of them said that they didn't. And the half who did, surprise, surprise, were all women psychiatrists. And half who didn't, mainly, were men. So that was very, disappointing, because if you know about it, then at least you can sort of get a little bit ahead of the game.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it should be an everyday conversation we have with everybody accessing service, sort of particularly mental health services. Anyone of childbearing age. I mean, what's really fascinating in mental health is we talk a lot about recovery. And whenever I've read or looked at about anything in recovery, it's about work and leisure. Yeah. Now, I don't know about anybody else in this world, but, when I'm feeling not great, what's important in my life is my relationships and my friendship. Where it has its, and my leisure activities, they're all there to support. But we don't talk to people about relationships and about planning. And it's not, lots of people in this world might not want a child, but actually to have a conversation with somebody in a mental health service to say, this is your diagnosis, or this is the kind of treatment plan, or this is the intervention, whatever kind of terminology we want to use. But part of that is our learning about how important relationships are, that you might want to be a parent at some point, and how to, who you might want to talk to, and these are some resources you might want to use, and this is who you can, you can talk to your GP, you can come back and talk to us, and actually just make it a very normal, natural conversation. I don't want to assume that everybody wants a parent, but there's no harm in saying that for somebody of childbearing age, I mean, we don't have the conversation with men about contraception, or, about what they kind of might view in terms of their role as a dad, or, So, I mean, we happen to be talking about women in preconception because of really wanting to reduce the risk and really enabling women to have that conversation. But I think as staff members, we should be able to be open to think about it in terms of enabling people to move on from our services in a positive way. If that makes sense.
It's actually really, and I have to say, to be honest, before we started having these conversations, I hadn't thought about it that much. And I've been in mental health nursing for 20 years, not really. Talked about it really. I talked a lot about kind of sex and consent and things like that, but never the outcome. And I think we talk a lot about risk as well. And as Claire was saying, this puts people at tremendous risk. Yeah. And the other thing I think is the grief that must be around that as well for some people. Whether you choose to or not, the fact that something that you assume is going to, just one part of your life where this doesn't interfere for just 1 minute isn't there. I think that must be really, really hard for people as well. And to be able to have those conversations is really important.
It's interesting because I work with this. Sorry, Katie. Go.
Oh no, I was just going to say, to pick up on what you were saying. It's not a lot of sort of questions I think in the medical setting sometimes come after, are you thinking about having children? No, end of conversation. And it can't just be a case of that. As Chris was saying, it's about normalizing these conversations. So just to speak to people and say, if you were to get pregnant, you might want to think about these different factors, and here are some further services that you could access to continue these conversations, rather than just shutting it down based on whether or not someone's actively thinking about pregnancy at that moment. And I think often you really shut those conversations down about being a mother or becoming pregnant for a long time, until perhaps it's sort of, as Claire said, you have a few years where you want to sort of maybe prepare for the healthiest pregnancy possible. So getting in early, and I think people really will remember those initial conversations, because it is such a big topic for people.
Yeah. But the way you get asked must be really important too.
Yeah, it's also building that knowledge about somebody's life. Yeah. I mean, years ago when I started in mental health in 1980, very old, but never mind. It was common practice to draw a diagram. You had a genogram, you had it worked out who was in the family. you know, it's interesting what we've kind of lost sometimes. I mean, I'm sure some practitioners still do it, but, you know, who is your partner? Do you have a partner? Do you, you know, what's your relationship? You know, we talked about, you know, equality, and we talked about kind of different types of relationship, you know, so in terms of somebody's sexuality, we need to understand those things if we're going to provide a kind of, for want of a better word, a kind of holistic approach to really understand what the triggers might be. So within the resources that you'll access, there is stuff around domestic violence and abuse, because we recognise that actually that also increases the risk, you know, in terms of to the woman herself, to the child, to the kind of how you know, that pregnancy or that conversation around preconception might occur. Sorry, it's a bit of a ramble, but you know, that unless we sit down and really help somebody and talk to somebody about, you know, their relationships, who their partner is, and if they don't have a partner, what, you know, kind of what their future desires might be, we can't help somebody plan, and we can't reduce the risk.
Did you want to say something, Claire, before we go? We'll take some questions in a sec.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, you know, in relation to what Chris was just saying, because I sort of help with these topics on the forum for Bipolar UK, and we get a lot of women on there who are thinking about having children, or scared of having children, or don't know what to do, things like that. And in the last couple of years, I suppose, there have been more women who are thinking about having a child on their own. So obviously having a child on your own with bipolar as well is quite a tough thing. And I also, you know, people have emailed me and said, what do I think about it, and all that kind of thing. And I always say, well, this is the whole thing. You've got to think about your whole support system, haven't you? Because, you know, obviously you can't say to anybody whether you should or not have a child, but if for that person to think about, you know, who they've got there to support them, and how, you know, I'm a new grandma, and my daughter, who's a health visitor, is going bananas with her baby not sleeping at the moment, you know, both of them, and her husband is just like up the wall. And so you think, well, that is really, really stressful for them. If you're on your own and you've got a mental health condition, you know, you can only really think about, I would have thought, doing that if you know you've got your mum, or, you know, your sister, or family, or really good friends, or somebody around you who's going to help you, because you can't really rely on services, I don't think.
Well, you also have to change quite a lot of your own coping strategies. And if you're managing a lot of your mental health issues by, you know, I have a special sleep pattern, I have a routine that I keep to, and also no routine for you. It's really different.
Yeah, and sleep is such a critical thing for bipolar. You know, it's very triggering. So it's, you really, really have got to make sure you have support.
Let's have a couple of questions. So, hello, I can see some people watching there. It's nice to see you guys. We've got a question from Adrian saying, a really interesting conversation. How can we improve screening? When I was clinical, there's a lot of professional stigma to mental health and addictions, which is background. And having completed serious case reviews, it seemed to me that screening questions weren't asked or referrals not made. So what can we do to improve that screening?
I suppose for me, it's that it goes back to that conversation about having this as routine kind of conversations with people. So not making assumptions about somebody's life or their relationships, but also not getting into that kind of, oh, we've got a standard template question, you know, do you want a baby? Yes, no. Oh, it's no. Right. Okay. Moving on to the next one is much more trying to kind of understand it in terms of, you know, and not everybody's keen on this word, but the kind of whole concept of something around recovery, around enabling, around kind of, you know, you've just talked about sleep, and if you're a single parent and how stressful that is, so you're going to have different coping mechanisms. So there's something about kind of people who come into, you know, of a kind of childbearing age, coming into services, thinking when that initial assessment is, so who's in their network, who's important to them, you know, and whether that's, you know, a 17-year-old coming into CAMS, or whether that's a 23-year-old coming into adult services, you know, what is it who's in their network, who's supportive, who isn't, who might trigger a problem. And I know we kind of do that, but we don't do it through this lens of seeing people in different roles. You know, they might already be a mum and they might want another child. They might be a dad and they might, you know, be worried. They might, you know, they might be a sister. They might still be living at home with younger kids. You know, there's all sorts of things. So that's why my passion is around that whole kind of family approach. Who's in the family? What do we need to understand? And how does that impact on what we can provide as a service?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another one here. Did you want to jump in, Dave, at all? I don't want to put you on. I asked him last week if he wanted to, and I didn't want to. So I don't want to, but he's a health visitor, so I need to ask. Go on.
No, so we've got some extra questions with Nicky.
Cool.
So Mushtag's sent a few really good questions in. One of them is about the lack of diversity in perinatal specialist midwives, social workers, health visitors, psychologists, and child adolescent clinicians. Does that have an impact in outcomes of care, and how can services and staff become more inclusive and accessible?
Well, I would have thought it must have an impact, mustn't it? I mean, it would be much, you know, preferable if there was much more diversity. But I suppose that's more from sort of like further back up the pipeline, really, in terms of really positively encouraging people to get involved, rather than sort of the midwives we've got now.
Yeah, I know one of the pieces of work that we're doing for psychology is to look at how we get a much more diverse sort of range of people involved, and it seems very much kind of a white middle class female role at the moment, and sort of recognising how much better it'd be. I think the other thing is about how much community groups can become involved, and obviously, you know, there's a better chance that community groups would better represent the communities that they're sort of based in. But the kind of problems where we've seen such a lot cut back over the last few years in terms of, you know, support that charities would get from local authorities, for example. So it makes sort of everyone's job sort of much more difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, Alfonso's asked another question around diversity, and is there any research or best practice on same-sex parenting and their experiences of parenting and mental health?
I was just talking about this before we started the call, as kind of a special interest of mine, as I haven't so I've been working in kind of perinatal mental health for 2.5 years now. Gosh, well, for me anyway, not for Chris. I'm very young to the game, but no, from what I've been kind of familiarising myself with in terms of the perinatal mental health research, I haven't seen a lot of it. I know that there's, I was speaking to another colleague about this, and there's some evidence from up north on the Wirral study, where they followed up about 1,000 parents, and I think, it was a very small double-digit number that was same-sex parents. So it seems like there's a real need to dive into that population and start speaking with same-sex parents to see if there's sort of additional needs and how those either are being served currently, or what sort of additional support needs to be made available.
I don't want to predict what research is going to find, but I think you can guess, can't you? Sorry, Clare, interrupted you.
Yeah.
That's right. I was just going to say that I was one advantage that I know about, certainly in the MBUs where they don't let dads stay overnight because they haven't got proper facilities. So they won't allow dads to stay, like even on a camp bed on the ward or whatever, like for women with postpartum psychosis stuff. But a female partner can. So that's a big plus.
It's one win.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because you can see that the more layers of sort of difference or discrimination that come in, the harder it is to get that service. And it's already a service that is not really where it needs to be in terms of reach. So I think we can see where perhaps the future research needs to come. So more questions from you, Dave?
Oh, there was one that kind of fits in with that as well about, do you think inpatient family units should be brought back where all members of family can be treated, or at least have one-stop shop for outpatients?
I certainly would agree that we need to work significantly better across our CAMS and adult divide in mental health services, because we are at risk of working in a kind of several silos. I mean, working with the whole family and be completely unaware that two or three services might be involved. So I kind of really do think we, and not just, because somebody's going to family therapy, but as a routine, that our services work more collaboratively together, without a doubt. Because I think then it's less confusing for the family. There's more understanding about impact. You're not then just focusing on one individual. So, however that might look, I think there's various ways. But it is quite interesting as somebody, when we've set up the Helping Families team, we're seen as a CAMS national specialist service, despite the fact that we get referrals from adult services and CAMS. And it's just, to be perfectly honest, a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare from a kind of, writing on the notes to who funds, and, so we get one pathway sorted, and then that upsets somebody else because it doesn't make sense. So there's lots of constraints sometimes that clinically you just think, I just wish somebody would just kind of get rid of some of that, because it doesn't, we can do a whole family approach. Certainly I've worked in children's social care for a number of years, and they've really valued the role of having a mental health nurse working alongside them, helping them to kind of negotiate and understand what might be going on. And it's helped those conversations, because it means they don't just focus on diagnosis and risk. It means they understand services that are being provided by adult mental health or CAMS. And that kind of, so I think us being more imaginative about how we provide services, there's got to be a way forward. And I think it goes back to that earlier comment, is that then it might attract more people. If we're going into schools and talking to people about what attracts people to these kind of roles, some sort of diversity in what we're providing might make it more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. There's some questions coming in from, one on doulas. Do you think that would help to have somebody who's maybe in a non-medical type role coming in and having somebody just as almost like a friend, partner, guide? Have you any thoughts on that? Any awareness of if it's worked, if it's happened, if it's been researched?
I don't know whether it's been researched much, but it certainly can work. We have a doula organisation, a charity that is part of our Maternal Mental Health Alliance. I know, but I know that it can cause problems as well if there's because individuals sort of perhaps take on their role. They see themselves more as midwives, and perhaps and there can be some frictions there. I've certainly heard of that in the past. I don't know how much.
Yeah, from my interviews with mums who've accessed these specialist perinatal mental health teams, there's definitely anecdotally, there seems to be a few instances where kind of someone's specific notes around their birth plan that they've created with the mental health team doesn't necessarily get passed on when they are on the ward in for an emergency C-section, and people are changing shifts, and their sort of specific requests which they've discussed, which they think will really help them kind of have the most sort of smooth experience possible, aren't always noticed. And I don't know whether there would be a role for a doula to come in as someone who kind of bridges that gap between mental high side of things and then on the wards themselves.
Maybe. I've got a question from one of the students, which is quite an interesting one. So if you want students saying, I had this conversation on the ward in my first week when someone started talking to me about it. And basically what they're saying is, but they've just been taught that you pass mental illness on directly. So I'd imagine that they've still got quite an early understanding of how this experience happens for people. And they were like, and I just didn't know what to say. So have you any guidance or any suggestions on what to do under those circumstances?
I'm not sure I understood. Was it the
first year
student who had been told that, or a patient of theirs who'd been
the patient was talking to the student about it, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because that's the only person who's obviously sitting down to have that conversation, which is in itself a problem. But they've obviously they're just trying to understand maybe how people become unwell. And then they're thinking, oh, what if I tell this person, yes, they have a baby, it's great, and then they pass it on. What if they don't? I guess what I would say is it's not your choice to make. So you don't have to worry about that necessarily. Just direct it to how other people, when other people have or don't have babies, is not your problem. That's not your job. Your job is to make sure that people have the best information they can to make their own choices for themselves, I would say.
Yeah, but I would hope that they would know they would have the knowledge themselves to say what the risk of passing them on it, because obviously there are for certain. I'm always being asked that for bipolar, and a lot of people misunderstand and think that it's definitely like 100% hereditary and everything else, and it is actually a 10% chance of your child having bipolar. So that can be the difference between somebody giving up or thinking, oh yes, I can have children.
Yeah. But it also goes back to that earlier conversation about the more that you have these conversations, the more people get to know. Knowledge is power, and actually then people can get help. The risks to our mental health is when we don't get help at the right time, the right help, or and then we're in crisis. So that then impacts on the children and young people. So I've worked with lots of young people who are really worried about, they're often doing quite significant amount of work in the home, they're supporting their parent, and they are worried about what it might mean for them. But actually they have quite a lot of a really good understanding about their mental health and well-being and what works. But again, it's that going back to that exploring what works for somebody, what are the triggers, what can we kind of do to kind of reduce the stress at certain points of the year, what is it for that individual, rather than this is the diagnosis and this is what it's going to mean for somebody. Diagnosis is really useful, but only in the concept of what it means for me as an individual. What is it? Well, how do I experience it? And how might that impact on my family? What does my family need to understand? Because as Claire says, you start getting into that kind of genetic argument. It can be really stressful and really difficult, because my child's experience might be very different from mine.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. So we're sort of coming towards the end. That's flown by already. So one of the things I was thinking about, our last sort of question was around what can people do to help families thrive. So what sort of things can staffs and students and families and friends do? What can we be doing to help this situation?
I guess this is a good opportunity to plug the resources, which Nicky and
they've tweeted out. They're already there.
Fabulous. So the three of us were recently involved in a big piece of preconception care work with Public Health England and NHS England, King's and Tommy's and Bipolar UK, and lots of different stakeholders came together to really look at what was out there and existing in this field and what we could do to pull together all of the evidence and repackage it for clinicians and also for women themselves, so that it wasn't just a trickle down effect and people could find this information and it was kind of distributed. So there's the drier side of things, which is my area, which is the kind of research document and an evidence review. And then there's a health professional resource for essentially anyone working at any point in the journey with women with serious mental illness. But these preconception resources are very much applicable to anyone planning on having a child, because we know that sometimes in pregnancy it might be a woman's sort of first experience of difficult mental health, whereas it might not have happened before. Then they're on the Tommy's website. They partnered with us and have got some really great sort of online, it's kind of a questionnaire that you can do and fill in certain yes/no boxes, and you can sign up to directed emails to get more information about kind of planning for a healthy pregnancy and serious mental illness and what to be aware of. just sort of steamrolled there. I don't know if Chris and Claire wants to jump in. I have to say
absolutely. No, if you plug in the resources, go for it. So they're on Twitter at the moment, but we'll pop them over when we finish onto the Facebook Live page as well if you're looking for those. But they're under the MHTV tag.
Great. Just to add to that it's not all very dry. And I did have loads of quotes from women themselves.
Just the academic bits, not the ones for the women themselves.
And there's a very user-friendly case study as well in there, talking about her experience.
So people can get involved, they can find out about stuff. Yeah, and just know and actually pass it on and remind people to ask and have those kind of open conversations, really important. Is there anything else that we can do to be supportive?
And just for me, it's like my mantra is that kind of whole family approach. You know, whoever you're working with, and I define family. I'm not defining who that family is. You know, who is important in the network of the people we're working with, and can we bring them together in order that the safest care and the kind of better understanding of what's going on for somebody can be shared within that family. And that might be somebody's neighbour, it might be their best mate. As I say, it's not for me to define, but I think we will do better, and children and young people will be less at risk. We will reduce risk for parents if we have that whole family approach. You know, can we bring young people into a care program approach meeting? And I can imagine some of my colleagues going, really? And I'm going, yes, you can. There is nothing wrong with bringing a 14-year-old with the parents' understanding into that concept, you know, and actually thinking about a safety plan for them. Who do they phone? You know, and if you have that hat on throughout, it means that actually women will be accessing preconception care, because it will be a natural conversation to have, to share those resources with somebody. And to go back, you know, these need to be repeated conversations. They're not a one-off in somebody's life. You know, if they don't feel like having a baby this year and they come back and see you next year, it's, you know, we can repeat the conversations.
I mean, there's nobody else who makes decisions like that. It's like you were asked when you're 25, you said no. Like, that's up to you. It's like, it's not a one-time deal, is it? Is there any sort of like last thoughts or something that you'd like to leave the audience with? Because we will obviously be wrapping up soon. So shall I come round to you, each one of you? Claire, is there anything you'd like to just share before we head out?
Yeah, just quickly what Chris was saying about the sort of somebody's network, whoever they are, and how important it is for them to sort of get a bit of knowledge about it, and that, you know, and there are things on like Bipolar UK's website and APP about Tommy's and Mind and other websites that are very accessible, and you know, there's lots of peer support on those that they can just go on and chat to other people who've been in the same situation, which is a lot more accessible for some people than reading dry stuff about it. But just quickly to say, particularly from women with bipolar point of view, they can be great parents. So I just want to emphasise that, because they really can.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to say it straight up and out proud, isn't it? Because there's a lot of implicit head shaking and sighing, and no one, exactly, you're right, that a lot of people are stopping saying those terrible things that people used to say. I mean, I don't know if any of the younger students remember things like refrigerator mothers and all these appalling sexist unpleasantries that were said to women who had mental health issues and families, and that, thankfully, that's pretty much stopped. But a lot of that kind of hangover stuff is still there. There's implicit judgments about someone's capability or capacity to love is just nonsense, frankly. Just nonsense. Katie, is there anything you wanted to add as we were heading out?
Yeah, I guess just to go back to those starting conversations early, and, you know, talking about children doesn't have to be making a decision to have a child. It's just an awareness of not only the mechanics of it, which we get taught at school, along with sort of, this is how you have sex and this is what happens when a baby's born, but everything that comes alongside it. So the relationships, which are absolutely key, and just an awareness of the kind of broader context around motherhood, so that people don't only think about it the first time that they think, oh, I think I'm going to try for a baby, and they've had an awareness of it for a much longer time.
Absolutely. Bruce, was anything you want to add? And then we'll come to Dave and see if there's anything from him.
I think, as Katie said, you know, embedding these into regular conversations. This isn't a one-off. I think it then enables people to access early help, which lots of our women with SMI don't, and that's discrimination. So I think if we can't talk about stigma and discrimination without talking about sex and relationships and a whole family approach.
Absolutely. Dave?
Hello. Yes, so the big thing I wanted to plug was this month is the Mental Health Nursing Journal is a special on perinatal mental health. So obviously if people's appetite have been whetted tonight, then do get a copy of this. It's actually a free copy that we're doing this month because it was produced in partnership with the Maternal Mental Health Alliance, which I know Claire's already mentioned this evening. And we did that because we're at MHA, we're a part of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance too. And, you know, organisations like Maternal Mental Health Alliance and the First 1001 Critical Days Coalition have done so much good work in this space. And we're really proud to be a small part of that too. So I'd encourage anyone that's watching tonight that aren't aware of those two organisations, alongside great organisations like Tommy's, you know, please do kind of look up their Twitter handles and have a look at the work that they're doing. And obviously, you know, it's Happy Infant Mental Health Awareness Week as well this week. That opportunity to highlight how important infants' mental health is. You know, we know that parents' mental health can sometimes be forgotten, but we know that babies, infants and young people's mental health often falls through the cracks too. So just be mindful of that as well. And obviously the best way of supporting an infant's mental health is by supporting parents' mental health. Because we know about that relationship that parents and, you know, is so important. Parents and babies relationship, you know, needs to be nice and strong. So, yeah, final thoughts from me, Nicky, back to you.
Fantastic. Well, I'm obviously not one to make any further comments on it, knowing absolutely zero about babies. So let's finish up. But so thank you very much, everyone, for your time today, and to our fantastic panel for really opening up a discussion that I don't know that much about, frankly. And I guess it's no problem not to know, but it's a problem to carry on not knowing. So we've got the links out there. So please have a look at them, retweet them, send them to people who you think need to see it, and have those conversations. And thank you ever so much for your time. Much appreciated. Good night. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.